So the final speaker for the first half is Dr. Agha Saeed. He's a lecturer in the African American Studies Department at UC Berkeley, and he is the national chair of the American Muslim Alliance, and also the chair of the American Muslim Task Force on Civil Rights and Elections. He's also an author of a forthcoming book, Pakistan in Its Own Mirrors, Elite Autobiographies and National Consciousness.
Good evening. As I sat here and listened to two mothers and then a very thoughtful speaker, or two thoughtful speakers, who gave rather impersonal view of the situation, I was reminded of a scene in Hindu scripture, Bhagavad Gita. Those of you who have read it, is the scene of war, where the saint soldier, Arjuna, is confronted by Krishna, who is God incarnate. And it's the God incarnate who calls on him to fight. And Arjuna, who is supposed to be born to fight, this is his duty, this is his dharma, to fight. He raises a point that I believe is fundamental in this moment. He says, I don't want to fight, and he gives a number of reasons, and then finally he says, for we know not if their victory or ours is better for us. And I think there might have emerged a moment in the world to reflect on that meaning and to say what kind of victory is good for us and will ultimately serve our purposes that we are seeking. And second is the moment in the same scripture when supposedly the evil side has been defeated. And Krishna goes before Yudhishthira and bows before him and says, I bow before you because no good is entirely good and no bad is entirely bad. And I believe it creates two different conceptions. One which is Manichaeism, which says good is entirely good and bad is entirely bad. Either you are with us or you are against us. And the second is the conception which says we are all combinations of good and bad. And it is a human destiny to come to grips with combinations of good and bad that exist in all of us. And that may be the moment that has arrived, where we have looked to look inside and outside. What I call dual critique, dual, simultaneous, interrelated critique of the self and the other, without privileging either. Which then creates the commitment to correct yourself when you are wrong, and to have the courage of conviction when you are right. And I believe that today, as a Muslim, when I speak here, I speak of a Muslim charter of obligations. I believe Muslims have, as the citizens of this country, the duty and the obligation to defend this country physically. Defend it against violence, against terrorism, against war, against sabotage. I believe Muslims also have an intellectual obligation to defend this country intellectually. And that is to defend the values that make this country a unique country, a decent country, and those are the values of civil liberties and human rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of association. And third is to defend this country spiritually. And how do you defend a country spiritually? You defend it by respecting the humanity of all, creating a common cause with them. This is the charter of obligation that I believe we have at this time. Muslim organizations, 10 of them, have come together to create a task force on civil rights and elections. And I believe the issue of civil rights and the issue of war are very important not only for Muslims and Christian Arabs in this country, but for the US image and US role in the world at large. What we have in this country this time is a crisis of civil rights. And that crisis has been there before September 11, way before September 11. That actually started in some ways, and again I'm telling the story from the middle, it started in some ways with the law passed in 1996, Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, which among other provisions had a secret evidence provision, which said if you are not a citizen of the United States, you can be tried in a court of law without evidence being shown to you or to your lawyer. Most of the people who were incarcerated under that were Palestinians. So it became an instrument of silencing Palestinian and Palestinian Americans in this country, and Dr. Mazen al-Najjar was in jail for 3.5 years without ever being proven guilty of any crime. In 1999, US Supreme Court, no other institution but US Supreme Court, in a very important decision, ADC versus Janet Reno, said if you are not a citizen, you have no protection against selective application of law. To say you have no protection against selective application of law is to say there is no equal justice in the United States. Different people can be tried differently with different kind of punishments. And then of course came the USA Patriot Act. Now what lies at the center of US Patriot Act is not simply an act of profiling, but the act of profiling of thought, belief and conscience. This is 1984. This is what exactly Orwell had said, thought policing. And how is that thought policing taking place? I'll give you concrete examples. Person coming out of a mosque in Orlando, Florida is stopped very much on the property of the mosque itself in the parking lot, and the FBI official says, I would like to know, what did you pray today? And what was your priest sermon? What was the imam sermon? When the government say, what did you pray today? That is profiling of thought and belief. And that defines the crisis, in my judgment, of the civil rights that exists in this country. Now we have been engaged in a dialogue with the Democratic Party, and so far we have failed to hear from them a clear answer on the issue of civil rights. If you go to the Democratic Party's website, it says a document something to the effect, says building bridges to the Muslim American community and so on and so forth. And when it talks about the USA Patriot Act, it says John Edwards and John Kerry support most aspects of the USA Patriot Act. So we want to ask the very specific questions because we don't want to be in this vague, hazy area. What we want to know is what is their position on due process, what is their position on equal justice, most importantly what's their position on no ex post facto laws, no secret evidence, no secret proceedings, instituting habeas corpus, presumption of innocence till proven guilty in a court of law, access to a lawyer, and the confidentiality of communication between the lawyer and the accused person. It is precisely this fact that constitutes the crisis of civil rights in this country at this time. But I am very pleased to tell you, the way I read it, there is a tremendous civil rights movement in America today. And I believe since the end of Vietnam War, this country has not seen this kind of a movement. What I'm talking about is 341 cities and counties, independent of each other, passing resolutions and ordinances to seek repeal of the USA Patriot Act or parts of USA Patriot Act. There are 4 states that have passed resolutions to the same effect. There are 24 states, including my state, California, that is in the process of reflecting on that. Now, when many people, independent of each other, come to the same conclusion and move in the same direction, that to me is the beginning of a movement. What we have in this country today is a genuine grassroots civil rights movement. What we are lacking is a national figure or a national entity, more than a figure, an institution that could give it national expression and national coherence. I was hoping Mr. Rolf Nader will be here at this time so I could challenge him to that effect, but that would have to be next week when I see him in Chicago. So what we see here right now is the need, and I am proposing a partisan thing, that is a need to connect the issue of civil rights with elections. Because I believe elections, among other things, are a process in which larger issues can be brought to public attention and one could proceed in the direction of finding solutions for that. So I would highly recommend you think of the election in terms of civil rights, also in terms of war. Now it was former Congressman Pete McCloskey who spoke at one of our events, and he said, one of the central questions in this war is it going to be a war against terrorism or is it going to be a war against Islam? I think the question has not been answered. The question needs to be answered because it moves in very different directions. Secondly, we need to ask and answer very clearly and coherently, is it going to be a war of occupation or war of liberation? Because when we say it's a war of liberation, there are some fundamental problems in that very notion. Could war really be an instrument of social change of the type that we are talking about? Because let's remind ourselves, for the last 50 years there have been 2 movements for democracy in the world. One has been the movement for democracy in the world by the West, where the West has been calling on third world countries and second world countries to democratize themselves, to build institutions, to have coercion-free consent of the world in terms of who they want to lead them, and so on and so forth. But there has also been a demand by the third world countries for democracy among nations. The entire focus of the 9/9 movement was actually to seek democratization of the United Nations. Isn't it a hypocrisy of the whole system? That after having said in the first section of the UN Charter, that this organization is being created to save succeeding generations from scourge of war, to ensure the dignity of the human individual, and to ensure sovereign equality, the same documents then proceeds to give 5 nations the right to veto. Where is sovereign equality if 5 nations have the right to veto? So there are 2 movements in the world for democracy. One democracy inside the nations and one democracy among the nations. What we would like to see at the beginning of the 21st century, not only that Iraq should become democratic, but the US should also become democratic in terms of its relationship with the rest of the world. Now the issue of Iraq, I think, is an interesting one. Because when Saddam Hussein, who was clearly a thug and a dictator, when he was ruling that country, less than 2% of the people of his country were involved with the governance of Iraq. When the Bush administration is ruling over that country, less than 2% of the people are involved with the governance of that country. As a matter of fact, and this is a favor that Rajiv Chandrasekaran, an Indian-American writer who writes for Washington Post, has done to all of us by writing a dispatch from Iraq. He said Brimmer brought a plan from Washington, gave it to Iraqi opposition, and asked them to submit it back to him as their own. So the Brimmer plan, which was given to the Iraqi opposition to be resubmitted to the administrator, to the ruler, whose plan it was to begin with, involved less than 2% of population in holding elections through a caucus system, where it was going to be the US occupying power that were going to decide the people, even the 2% who will participate. It was Imam Ali Sistani, the Shia Imam, supposedly a fundamentalist, who said, no, we want democracy, but we want the real democracy. We want 1 person, 1 vote. Who is teaching democracy to whom here? Again, it is not a fight with American ideals. It is the hypocrisy and dishonesty in maintaining those ideals. When it was Saddam Hussein ruling over the country, large contracts were given to his friends and his cronies in a non-bid contract process. When the Bush administration is ruling over Iraq, large contracts are being given in a non-bidding process to his friends and his cronies, including Halliburton, where the Vice President of the United States had a personal interest. When Saddam was ruling over that country, people were tortured in the prisons. We have heard about that. When Bush administration is ruling over their country, people are being tortured in the prisons. When Saddam ruled over that country, the rich and the elite stayed in the palaces. When US administration is ruling over that country, US troops are staying in the same palaces. When Saddam was ruling over that country, knowledge production was controlled by the state, and it was decided by the state what will go into the book of history in describing different events and different historical narratives. When US is ruling over that country, knowledge production is controlled by the occupying power. Where is the sense of liberation for which Iraqi people should be so thankful? So I think what we are doing here is passing occupation as liberation. And we are expecting this liberation to yield the type of results that most occupying powers in world history have desired for, but almost always failed. Please remind yourself of Lord Thomas Wellington Macaulay, who was the Brimmer of his day, a scholar and administrator. When he went to India, he wrote his famous Minutes on Indian Education, in which he said we must create a class of people in India who are Indian by ethnicity and blood, but European by taste and culture. How do you make people who are Indian by blood into European by taste and culture? He said through their education. And they changed their education system, they controlled it, they refocused it, and to some extent they got their desired result. But I believe the most coherent answer, almost directly addressed to that particular thesis, is given by French philosopher Sartre in his preface to Fanon's book, Wretched of the Earth, if you look at Sartre's preface to Fanon's book, Crash of the Earth, he says, when we went to rule over these countries, we created a class of people that he calls puppets. We shall say the words, their mouths will open and the words will come out. He said then came a second class of people that he calls the Greco-Latin Negroes. The Greco-Latin Negro, he says, was a person who was well versed in the classics of Greece and Rome, who knew the literature, who knew art, who knew culture, who knew philosophy, who knew religion, and he could speak the master's idiom back to the master, as good as the master, sometimes even better. And the master was overjoyed. What have I created? He talks back to me and he will protest. He said, then came the third generation of people who were cultural schizophrenics. People who had made it, who had become the brown sahibs, who had the privilege, who were the elites, and yet their consciences were not totally at ease. They were always torn, they were always divided. And the fourth, he said, came a class of people who were revolutionaries. Now, because Fanon spoke of violence, and he had no problem with that, his conception of revolutionary usually is very quickly ignored, or hidden, and not paid attention to. And I think one man in this country, 15, 20 years ago, who brought the essence of that out was late Iqbal Ahmed, in his famous essay, Radical But Wrong. And as you know, Iqbal had worked very closely with Fanon. But the point that Fanon was making that is different than carrying out violence was the revolutionary. Revolutionary was not necessarily who fought, who was better at fighting, who was better at out-organizing and out-propagandizing the enemy, who was able to reach to other sides better. And the example that I'll give you from that is, it will not be a person who actually walks into a trap and fights his way out of it. It is somebody who looks at a trap and says, are you kidding? And walks away from it. What we have in Iraq today is a resistance movement building up. Look at the language of the New York Times. It has started by calling them thugs and terrorists and Saddam loyalists and so on and so forth, all the usual cliches. But now, occasionally it is becoming forced to call it insurgent movement, and Europe has started calling it resistance movement. I have yet to see a single coherent and serious analysis of the social composition of this resistance movement. Because a central fact has not been acknowledged and will not be acknowledged because it goes against the official grain. That is, we are committing an act of occupation. Occupation by itself is violence. When you occupy people against their will, you violate their souls. When people's souls are violated, they react in violent ways. That is the central point. What we see in Iraq today is an emerging coalition of working class, of the lumpen proletariat, of the middle classes, of the secular intelligentsia, and of the religious intelligentsia. Remind yourself, when was the last time that you saw the crystallization of these forces in such a short period of time? When US was occupying Vietnam, there was another superpower, namely Soviet Union on the other side, and China, and Korea, North Korea, that helped Vietnamese fight and seek their freedom. When Afghanistan was occupied by the Soviets, it was the United States and the NATO countries and the entire Middle East and Pakistan and Bangladesh and others who supported Afghans fight the Soviets and defeat them. Today there is not a single superpower or even a regional power on the other side. But have you noticed that Iraqi people have made the country practically ungovernable for the sole superpower in the world? The central fact there is the fact of occupation. We cannot force change on other people. What I think it is still time for the United States, and that is to hold elections, transfer power, and to live with dignity and honor. It will be making maybe short-term embarrassment, but that will be a long-term gain, because if Iraqi people at the end of the day do receive a democratic government that may be anti-US in the short period, they will still always remember it as a gift of democracy in the United States. But if the US is tempted to have democracy, but a pro-American democracy, we may end up spoiling what is possible within our reach. Thank you very much.